Hi all, I'm Bridget, and if you're like me, you're at the tail end of a 2 or 3 year master's degree course in counseling. And so it's time to take the CPCE or the NCE. And one of the things that I found helpful is to do a historical review. Sometimes in the context of the questions, you need to think about what time period that's happening, and sometimes that helps you answering the questions. So I went through and did a historical review of kind of the highlight points to think about something. So if somebody says G. Stanley Hall, that's relatively early in the psychology process. And if they talk about Dr. Marsha Linehan, that's later in the process. So I'm hoping this historical review is helpful to you. So starting from the 1700s to the early before the 1900s, this is the Industrial Revolution, and people are looking at the way that we are spending time differently. This is also the time of reason and logic. So you'll hear John Locke, and the term tabula rasa or blank slate is opined. William Wundt is W-U-N-D-T. William Wundt is the father of the first psychology lab in the United States. Obviously, this is around the same time as Freud and psychoanalysis. And G. Stanley Hall becomes the first American who gets a PhD in psychology, and also winds up being the person who creates what eventually becomes the APA, the American Psychological Association. William James, who is the brother of Henry James. So if you've ever read a Henry James novel, you know, long time ago. So William James publishes the Principles of Psychology, and he had been a doctor who had left during the Civil War, studied with Freud, came back and finished his MD. And then, of course, Jesse Davis, who is the father of school counseling. So that's kind of the 1700s to the 1900s. And then thinking of the next chevron, and that's the way I think of things, we have Clifford Beers, who's the father of the American mental hygiene moment. George Merrill, who's the father of Votech. So these things are happening very early on. And if you think about the tail end of the Victorian age and the beginning of the Gilded Age, a lot of these things about Western fundamentalism and manifest destiny, it makes sense that these things are happening. Then you have Frank Parsons, who's the father of career counseling, and some of the questions will be dedicated. But think about it. Again, this is 1909. He died, and his book was published after he passed away. So if you're getting one of those questions and you're thinking about the timeline of events, Frank Parsons, relatively early on, versus Carl Rogers later on. The Binet intelligence testing. So Binet was a French, what became a psychotherapist, and he was doing intelligence testing for children in the French schooling system. And then, of course, Pavlov, the father of classic conditional things. And then Edwin Thorndike, who publishes data that leads to operant conditioning and the law of effect and things like that. So again, 1900 to 1910, still relatively new in the field of psychology. 1910 to 1920, so again, another chevron. World War I, and World War I created the need for aptitude testing. You have all of these doughboys coming out of the military. They need to go someplace. So ASVAB and things like that start developing as a result of that. And the National Vocational Guidance Association, as well as the Smith-Hughes Act, making sure that the military had someplace to go. And then, of course, Carl Jung, who's the father of Neo-Freudian therapy and Jungian therapy. And Wertheimer, who was the father of Gestalt therapy. So again, 1910 to 1920, Gestalt has been around for a surprisingly long period of time, although we think of that more as being like the third force. Anna Freud, who's taking over from Sigmund Freud, who became the mother of child psychology. So prior to that, that wasn't really tabula rasa. You know, Locke said everybody's a blank slate, and Anna Freud is saying, well, maybe there are ways to look at this. And then Alfred Adler, who's the father of family counseling, and did a lot with family counseling and Head Start program and things like that. Going to the next chevron. So this is now 1920s to 1930s. And the strong interest inventory. So again, more vocational stuff. And if you think about it, this is Depression era. So they are thinking about where are these people going to go? What are they going to do for work? John Watson, father of behavioralism, little Albert, and then Klein, who is the mother of object relations therapy and play therapy. So again, 1920s, 1930s, you're talking about 100 years that they've been talking about things like this. Roosevelt's New Deal created millions of jobs. So think about the strong inventory. Think about all of the things that were happening in that time. And by placing it in time period, it helped me pass some of the questions. Going on to the next chevron, 1930s into 1940s, Depression. So we had the law stage in the 1920s to 1930s, 1930s to 1940. This is Depression. So Depression, the first major self-help group, Alcoholics Anonymous. And E.G. Williamson modifies the trait and factor theory with the Minnesota point of view test. So if you think about that time period, and all these things have been, everything old is new again. The George Dean Act, which helped people with counseling and guidance counseling and getting careers. And the first edition of the Dictionary of Occupational Titles, the DOT. And if you think about the DOT has gone away because it's now online. And then Jean Piaget with developmental theory and constructivist theory, and Kohlberg with moral development. So that's the 1930s into the beginning of the 1940s. So 1940s, starting with 1939 is World War II and the need for aptitude and achievement testing, not only during the war but afterwards. And the beginning of the field of mental health counselors. So if you think about it, psychology has already been around at that point for 100 years. But the idea of mental health counselors is a relatively new idea. After World War II, the need for group therapy, there simply weren't enough people to be able to facilitate therapy. And then Carl Rogers, who's the father of person-centered counseling. The George Barden Act, making sure that the military had what they needed. And the National Defense Education Act, the NDEA, for STEM programs, because Russia beat America into space. So think about that time. It's prior to the Cold War, but it's around that time when the Russians are kind of sort of our allies and maybe not really. And then the ACSA and the APGA, which eventually becomes the ACA and the APA. So because of Carl Rogers, now we're in the 1950s, 1960s, counseling, cognitive, behavioral, learning, career, Gestalt, REBT, marriage and family. These are now the standards of the 1950s, 1960s, and the very first time that the DSM was created. Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the father of humanistic theory, and of course Harry Harlow's horrors because of the monkeys, and the onset of a lot of career development theories. And if you think about it in the time, this is also the beginning of the silent generation giving birth to the baby boomer generation. So it makes sense. You've got a lot of folks that got to figure out where they're going to go and what they're going to do. In the 1960s and 1970s, again, the next chevron, the Community Mental Health Act by LBJ, as well as WREN. So WREN, WRENN, defines the school counselor role and makes that really a role as opposed to something that was just left over. And Albert Bandura's Bobo doll. Gilligan stated that Kohlberg lacked gender and did something based completely on gender. So Kohlberg only did it on males, so Carol Gilligan only did it on females. So you have to think about that in the light of what it was offered. You're in the beginning of the feminist movement, and so she focused on the female version of Kohlberg. And then Karen Horney, mother of feminism. My husband says horny women. I don't think that's necessarily a good mnemonic to remember, but Karen Horney is the mother of feminist psychology. And then Virginia Satir, the mother of family therapy. going into the 1970s, the Virginia. So Virginia state licensure was the very first in 1976, was the very first state licensure for counselors. And that has been on almost every test that anybody has ever said to me. So remembering that Virginia was the first state in 1976 to create licensure legislation. That's tough to say. AMCA is created, the ASGW is created, FERPA, so anybody who's done any GA stuff in as a graduate assistant in the university knows about FERPA and your ability to be able to see your own records. ICD-9 is created in the 1970s by the United States. Less than 10 years later, they're started to run out of numbers, which is why ICD-10 becomes popular, and that was done on the world stage. ICD-9 was created in the United States. Milgram's shock experiments. So remembering the two people who one was shocking the other, the one says, please stop, because there's authority figure there, they kept shocking. And then Niswander developed the use of methadone for heroin addiction. Inso Kim Berg, who's the mother of solution-focused brief therapy, and J.B. Miller, who is the mother of relational and cultural theory. So that's the 1970s into the 1980s. Again, new chevron, 1980 into 1990. CCREP is created, and the APGA becomes the AACD, which becomes the ACA, the American Counseling Association. The NBCC is created so that we have a standardization, and Chi Sigma Iota is created. Francine Shapiro, who becomes the mother of EMDR, discovers this in a walk on campus, and Marsha Lenehan becomes the mother of DBT. Motivational interviewing, William Miller, and T. Sarbin, I don't remember what the T is, but the father of narrative psych. So that's the 1980s into the 1990s. 1990s, the National Institute of Mental Health is created. HIPAA is created. Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, HIPAA, not to be confused with HIPPA, which actually is a Treasury thing. So make sure that you always get that right. HIPAA, Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. Gottman, the Gottmans together create both the mother and the father of Gottman marriage therapy. And the IDEA creates school IEPs for school counselors. 2000 into 2010, brain spotting, still a relatively new procedure, is created, and Pinker argues against tabula rasa. So think about it, 300 years later, and they're finally going, maybe we're not all blank slates. And Brene Brown destigmatized mental health with her hugely popular podcasts and videos and things like that. 2010 into 2020s, all 50 states have now had licensure requirements, and LaVey states that sexual orientation starts with the brain and not deviance. ACA revamps their code of ethics. I think that happened in 2014. Obamacare, also known as the ACA, requires parity for mental health. And CAPTA, CAPTA, requires counselors to be mandated reporters. And the last thing that I have is faith-spotted ego becomes a figure in veteran PTSD. So that is historical review from the 1700s to today of the major events that happened. If you can think about it in terms of the chevron, sometimes it helps you to answer the question. So this is Bridget, and I'm rooting for you.